Well, welcome everyone, Richmond Fire family, to our podcast. My name is Lieutenant Mike Wilkins. I've got two friends and guests here with me today, Chief Rodney Epps, Captain Stacey Harris. We're going to discuss elevator emergencies. We run quite a bit of elevator emergency calls in the city. Just in 2021, we ran a total of 193. And from 2017 to 2022, 984 total. So with that being said, today we're going to cover some topics, some ways that we practice on how to safely remove occupants from stalled elevators. With that being said, I'd like to start with my guests, with them discussing the backgrounds. So Chief Epps, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
I think it's still morning. Good afternoon, actually. Well, I've been in the department now, it'll be 24 years in a couple weeks. I was lucky and blessed enough to go to Station 10 when I first came in, and was introduced on the sister company, being in Quint 10 at the time, to Rescue 2. Sure. And from that point on, did all the training and finally got transferred 2 years later over to Rescue 2. So fell in love with the whole tech rescue. Sure. And as I seen most of y'all when we all came in, it was either you loved it or you didn't. Sure. And if you loved it, you wanted to stay. So years later, we ran into a lot of things. And I'm glad you quoted those numbers, because I think we started to see that we were going on a lot of elevator calls, but most of us didn't have a set way of handling any of them until Rescue 2 kind of took lead on that back then. Sure. And decided to create some steps.
Policy.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Captain Harris?
Yeah, well, good afternoon too. I've come up on close to 21 years. So I started out in 2001, and I started off at Quint 6. And being at Quint 6, you ran a multitude of calls being downtown. And, it's kind of along working at Quint 6, we worked a lot at the time with Rescue 2. So that kind of developed my interest in becoming a member of Rescue 2. I thought I was going to go to Quint 10 before I got to Rescue 2, but I went straight to Rescue 2 when I finally got my transfer.
Sure.
So that's kind of where my interest has always been, doing confined space and the technical rescue stuff.
Sure. So I bet you both can say that your initial assignment sparked your interest in technical rescue.
Yes. Oh, definitely.
And I can attribute and thank you both for assisting me along the way as a young firefighter, gaining knowledge and just bouncing ideas off you in the past as a young firefighter at Station 10 and passing, especially during shift change. I'd pull you aside and ask you, tell you about a call we had the previous shift and pick your brain on,
right.
What went well, what didn't go so well. So.
And that's pretty much, I think, how most of us have gotten through this far, from understanding and learning from what has occurred in the past.
Sure. So, this is for both of you guys. Can you recall your most memorable elevator emergency incident in your career thus far?
Okay. I think one of my most memorable ones was pretty much right after we went through the training with the group that came to the city of Richmond. We did elevator training.
That's the group from New York?
The group from New York. And we went through and we kind of got the policy together, and everything just clicked, like everybody filled their role out, and then it went to the letter of the law of a successful rescue. I believe it was at the retreat hospital, and the company went to the elevator room. The company went to the floor where the person or the occupant was at, and they just followed the policy to the letter. And to me, it was like bread and butter from that point on.
Okay.
And when I would say memorable, I always go, my memorables are always my most negative ones.
Okay.
So before we had the policy, I think, which made me take my first class back in Winchester some time back, was because I saw us, and I won't ever say a company because I was a part of that situation at the time, try to bring a lady out of a very small opening. Okay. And told her to swing down onto a ladder to get out of an elevator that was stalled. And then later on, realizing that there was no power ever shut off, and that we probably put her in way more hazard than what she was in when she stayed in a safe elevator only 5 minutes before.
So we were lucky in that regard.
Yeah, so promised myself then, didn't want to exist by luck anymore. We should be more, as a professional organization, we have to be a little bit better than that. Thinking destiny and fate, that a lot of those things never came out with a negative outcome. But those are the ones that sparked my interest and made me realize we need something to be a little bit more standardized than what we do.
Sure. So the numbers that I mentioned earlier from 2017 up until now, the 984 incidents for service in regards to elevator emergencies, that's roughly just under 200 calls for service per year. So you can see it's a frequent call.
Absolutely.
And it must be taken seriously, and we must have all our members trained properly. Our residents are dependent on us to do so.
Absolutely.
Just yesterday, we had maybe 3 calls for service at truck 3 for elevator incidents, so it's quite common. So, getting into some procedural stuff, do you see any challenges with recalling the elevators, doing a call for service?
No major issues other than not making that you're not your first tool of choice.
Okay.
So always listen to some of the calls that go out for elevator calls. And as long as everybody realized when we designed the program, it was not for it to be that your single thing. So sometimes people get focused in on one particular thing that we taught because I think it's the easier or the coolest thing to do.
Sure.
All the things that proceed before then probably are just as important.
Okay.
So phase 1 is easy if it's going to reduce some of your time, if you have everyone from the maintenance there to kind of support that operation, but it doesn't always work.
Sure.
Then realize that once that doesn't occur, you still have to go to the regular steps. So I always tell people, yeah, it's a tool in the toolbox. Definitely you can use the phase 1 because we can do it from the outside, but definitely there's some other ways. I think we've found out for over the years the most effective way is recirculating that power, cutting it off, and then allowing everything to reset. Because at the end of the day, we know it's just a big computer.
Sure. And recirculating or rebooting the computer,
yeah.
give it at least a minute minimum to
Right.
recycle.
Absolutely.
And not only recalling of the elevators, but figuring out where the car is positioned and maybe making contact with the trapped occupant before you do anything.
Sure, absolutely. And those are the first steps that should happen anyway, because you got to definitely make sure that the car or the cars you're recalling actually is going to solve the problem in the end.
That's right.
So if you stick with that one trick pony every single time, you may just be calling down empty cars
Sure.
and find out they're in a completely different bank than where you thought. So
Sure. And Captain Harris, let's talk about the officers' size up initially when you arrive on scene to an elevator emergency. What do you think as far as the size of?
Well, of course, we've always been told that, we start our size up as soon as we get the call. So kind of being familiar with your district and knowing what buildings are going to have the different types of elevators. You could have the traction, you could have hydraulic, and now that's coming into forefront, the machine roomless types of elevators. So just kind of understanding what you're walking into when you get to the scene or get to the incident, understanding, just looking up and looking at the silhouette in the air, just seeing if it's a penthouse on top, if it's a taller building or older building, knowing that it's a traction, or if it's a hydraulic, if it's 6 stories and under.
Sure.
So.
And per our policy, procedure 410, size of cover is a type of occupancy, like you said, the height of the building, the type of elevator, hydraulic versus traction,
Mm-hmm.
and the time of day, that's a factor also.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned machine roomless, commonly referred to as MRL. That's I guess the future with new construction, and we see that in Scott's Addition, directly in our district.
Yeah.
Just yesterday, we pre-planned a building on Myers Street, the Scott's Addition, 947 Myers, and that's what they have. They have 2 elevator banks, but they're all MRL elevators. So it goes back to what you said, pre-planning and getting out in your district and knowing your type structures.
Yeah, having the machine roomless, it saves the building owner time and also space, so they can charge back to the tenants or whatever to have their, to basically charge more for their building.
Sure. So once the initial or first arriving engine company arrives on scene, we have a procedure in our policy called Lockout, Tagout. So Chief Epps, based on the policy 410, how should initial lockout, tagout procedures be accomplished? And what exactly is lockout, tagout?
So the good thing is for us, we know even in emergency situations, we can't bypass the fact that OSHA has laws. So OSHA, in its infinite wisdom, has always kind of regulated how things occur. we operate kind of in an emergency situation, so a lot of times we just can't throw everything out completely. So we have to follow the guidelines that OSHA requires to some point, which is to bring everything to what they call a zero state of nothing moving, especially when we start operating inside of a shaft.
Sure.
And a lot of times I think when people think they're opening up doors and all those things, well, I'm not operating in a place where I can get hurt. But at that point, you still have mechanical stuff going on with the occupant inside, plus the damage to the doors that can happen if the car moves. So biggest thing we try to remind all the firefighters to do is make sure that at some point that power, cutting it off, is so important to the whole process before you start doing anything that has to do with those keys.
Sure.
And so lockout is essentially that, is making sure that once you start working, nothing's going to suddenly change or get energized that should not be energized.
Sure.
We have to do it in a way that still allows us to respond, because typically if you go into a plant, lockout looks like somebody's taking a bunch of chains and locks and padlocks and tags and going in. Well, we don't have the affordability of that time. So ours usually look like two firefighters going to the room, and just like we just said, it's so easy, but once they get access to that, right now no one else can get access to that particular panel.
Sure.
It may require on a simple level for a firefighter to remain there, and at the far extent of OSHA's law, somebody remaining there or having that room somewhere that can be actually locked
Sure.
still qualifies as a lockout tagout.
Yes, sir.
But anytime we can't stay and physically make sure that that lock is, it may actually require you to talk to the rescue company if you have one on scene and actually physically put something on that lock to stop somebody from cutting it on.
Sure.
Because of all the things that could hurt us, the last thing you want is the surprise of working with someone close to an elevator and then having the elevator move. And if I really wanted to talk about one of the worst calls I went on, it was when I realized what lockout tagout should have been.
Sure.
Because we had movement in the car before we had our policy.
Gotcha. And those engine company members should be dressed in full PPE,
Absolutely.
SCBA.
And according to the policy, we tell them to take the extinguisher, because a lot of times if you find that the problem started there, you can at least have an extinguisher there to take care of whatever you might find as a fire hazard.
Yes, sir. Very good. And Captain Harris, you're assigned to Truck 3. We're the partners, Rescue 2, Engine 10. As a company officer, what would determine you activating the rescue company on an elevator incident?
Well, it's quite funny. I did have a few stories of activating the technical rescue. But however, to the letter from OSHA, it's that 3-foot opening. If there is a blind shaft, if you open the elevator car with the power secured and off, and you do manipulate the escutcheon hole and get that inner door and outer door open, and then you see that the occupants are 3 feet from the landing, then that requires a technical rescue to be implemented.
Okay. And how often would you say that occurs in the city?
Well, if I'm looking at the numbers here, I would probably say, at least 5 to 10%
Sure.
of the time.
Sure. And in addition to the engine company members being dressed in full PPE and going to the machine room, I thought crossed my mind to have the engine company bring in some EMS equipment, because we don't know what the condition of the patient will be. Sometimes once we open the door, we don't dispatch a Richmond ambulance unit to
Right.
the incident. So that's something else to keep in your toolbox.
That might be something we might need to add, because and we do have that fire, injury, or panic are consequences for us that kind of accelerate our normal operations. So I guess if we're thinking about injury and panic, both of those could be injuries.
Sure, sure. And in regards to that policy, what information, if any, would you add to the current elevator emergency policy and procedures? We touched upon it a little bit.
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit. I believe, looking at 410, I think we probably should revisit the fact of what company or which company should do what particular step. Before we went to the current model, we had the engine company or the quick company do this, and the second company that's on scene do that, and then the rescue company does this particular function. So I think it's kind of generalized now, so if we could maybe tap into, kind of get a little bit more specific, I think that would be a help to the policy.
Sure.
Yeah. And I understood the Lexipol probably has eliminated a lot of the legal liability of being 2 steps, but probably a training document needs to come in where we go back to the steps, because I think what we're missing now is a lot of people don't realize what we had previously, so they don't equate to dividing the labor on the scene. Because one company really couldn't do all the things that are required to do sometimes, because like you said, somebody should be up there ready just in case this person's in a panic. So you almost need the full company to go do the first initial investigation. But it's sometimes we let other companies just kind of sit on the truck. They should be a part of that whole process.
Sure.
Because they could easily go do some of the things and get ready and set up. And we all know, once we get in, sometimes we find out that it is encompassing more than 1 floor. So it's easier to have everybody, and that's why the policy says bring in multiple keys, because a lot of your operations end up being divided into operations on multiple floors.
Yes, sir.
Because especially if the person's stuck in between, like the blind shaft situation that we sometimes run into.
True. So you think that could be just due to a lack of training and confidence in your skill set, maybe?
I think it's because we streamlined it so much. A lot of we've had a lot of turnover, not turnover, but I would say a lot of attrition over the years.
Sure.
So we did that large training at the very beginning, and I think we had the initial policy that still said quint and rescues, which no longer exists.
Yes,
When Lexipol policy came out of it, it would eliminated really a lot of the details.
Sure.
Because of just the way, the nature of their template. But I think that needs to probably be revisited, because I think a lot of times one company feels like they got to do all the tasks. And let's be serious, if you don't know how to divide your labor up, you'll just probably go without.
Sure.
Instead of calling for the additional companies. So
Sure.
I always say, try to remind companies, are any other resources needed? Because a lot of times if you don't prompt, they're thinking that I have to just do it with whatever I have in here. And it's not sometimes just as simple as cutting the power off. It's cutting the power off and making sure that the patient inside. Because remember, at the end of the day, we don't really care about the car.
Sure.
We care about the person in it. If it was just an empty elevator, we wouldn't even come to the call.
Sure.
It'd just be a maintenance issue. The person's the only thing that we really should be caring about anyway. So if we're not coming in there focused on patient care, the rest of the call doesn't mean anything.
And like you said, the occupant is probably most safe in the car.
Inside, definitely.
Until the power can be secured and the occupant can be removed safely. So we talked about the rescue company, but I think the fire marshal's office can also be involved. Sometimes when you open the Knox box, when you're responding to a structure, there's no elevator key.
Right.
So oftentimes there's a master key, and maybe some notes, and maybe a fob, but there's no elevator key. So I think that's part of the pre-planning process to
Identify.
management, fire marshal's office, and that first responding unit are all on the same page.
Right. I think logistics made a good headway years ago, and a lot of people probably don't realize it. Your notes on the NBC was included by Captain Spanbauer sometimes back when he got standardized keys from Otis and a couple other ones on there to say what number key works whatever. So
Sure.
a lot of our pre-planning could be looking at your NBC early and looking to see if that one has an elevator. But for a lot of the ones that have not been inspected or anything hasn't been done, that's where prevention will probably be helpful.
Yes, sir.
They won't have a designation unless we tell them
Sure.
where
Sure.
it is.
And that goes back to getting out in the district, and
Pre-planning.
especially with new construction.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of new construction in the city happening right now. We see, like we talked about earlier, Scott's Addition booming.
It's a lot of growth.
Station 10's district. So there's been rumors of the elevators now going to the standard FEO-K1 key. Have you heard any talks about that?
That was, I think, in response to, I think New York's been doing that for a while, where they were just like, if you build, then it has to be this standard key, so we don't have to worry about a whole bunch of keys.
Yes, sir.
I think that was probably going to be something, like I say, for us, outside of our ability to control that, because builders control a lot of interest in our area. But
Sure.
that would be a great help for us if it did get standardized. But I just know none of the companies here in Virginia Remember, we worked with quite a few of them when we were developing our policy.
Yes, sir.
None of them are on the same page
Okay.
with how they want keys and the design.
Sure.
Kone and Otis and all of those are all different groups,
Yes, sir.
even though they might share the same union. So I would definitely love to see that happen, but I can't see that being something that's going to occur quickly here. And I think it took New York a lot of years
Okay.
to get to the point where they are.
Sure.
And I don't know if we have to push that would make someone think that there's that much of a need right now.
Okay.
It would definitely have to be way more than just, I would say, the city of Richmond saying that they need it.
Okay. So in the city of Richmond's case, it's probably like we talked about earlier, to get partner with the fire marshal's office and
Yeah.
the management and property manager to make
Yeah.
sure there's a key
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
the Knox box.
That would probably be the best way. I think we talk, most of the time when we go through now, which is good, something we didn't used to do before, that's probably one of the first things we talk to people about is elevators.
Sure.
Yeah.
Because it has been the thing that's either helped us in our operation or impeded our operations, either one or the other, so.
Sure. And Captain Harris, you touched upon the MRL or machine roomless elevators. Can you give us some examples in your district of what you've noticed?
Okay, I've noticed there's been some changes in some of the MRLs from the first edition. So many times, just like Chief Epps has said before, you kind of listen into some of the elevator calls. And I've noticed that a few companies have been encountering some of the MRLs. And from what I found through my research is that a lot of the MRLs are now from a 2019 or 2020 edition and newer. The phase one, phase one and phase two is probably not going to work when you try to go and try to use that to lower the elevator down to the first floor or to the lobby, or so to say.
Okay.
So that may be a non-starter on the 2019 and newer. We won't know the difference.
Sure.
Unless you go out and do some pre-planning and knowing that the builder is putting these elevators in. But that's one of the biggest changes that I've seen with MRLs.
Okay. See, my first encounter with the MRL in the city was Huguenot High School in Huguenot.
Right.
2017, 2018. I was a teacher stuck in the elevator. And, being unfamiliar with that district, we searched for the machine room.
Mhm.
And lo and behold, it was in a small closet
Right.
inside the elevator bank. So,
And just for background wise, for those who, because we do have quite a few people who came in, but we were no longer doing the elevator rescue thing. The machine roomless were a reaction, I think, from the builders over time, because we know most of the ones we go to that 6 stories and below are hydraulic.
yes, sir.
But EPA hit them a long time ago with getting rid of all those hydraulic potential hazmat being in the ground, because you built this big piston.
Okay.
And if you're coming in and taking an old building like we seeing in the Todd Lofts and all through the city, and you're starting from scratch, you don't have the time to dig a big hole to put a piston in.
Sure.
So the MRLs was like the answer. It was like, you don't have to build a piston.
Right.
It's going to be, everything's going to be in the shaft, and it's going to be a system of pulleys and electrical devices. So that kind of helped builders kind of come in and retrofit.
So it's a cost savings and maybe a
Yeah.
savings of space.
So that's all we're gonna see probably coming up for the next couple of years, because EPA doesn't allow them to put hydraulics in the ground anymore because they will leak, and there's a bunch of hazmat in the future. And if I was a builder, why would I go through that whole thing of creating this whole pit in the ground
Sure.
when all I have to do is go get a machine room? So just for clarification, because a lot of people may not have seen them yet,
Sure.
there are certain districts, when I was on Southside, they rarely go on any elevator calls whatsoever. So it'll be foreign to them to see their first machine roomless, and to understand that reason why they're there, and understand that probably in their districts, they'll probably see more of those than they will us seeing these old buildings that had pulleys and pistons in the ground.
So with the newer mid-rise apartments,
They'll all be
Yeah, they'll all be MRLs.
machine roomless.
Sure.
So it's probably the biggest revisit we probably need to do is to make sure everybody understands them, because what we're telling everybody to do right now really doesn't fit the model of our machine roomless. And I'm glad Captain Harris, when I came back onto Battalion 2, that's the first thing he got with me about, was like, we probably need to revisit and let companies know that a lot of the things on opening doors does not apply. That they even changes some of the landing zone issues. So we were talking about all the stuff with these 3 foot, and if it's outside the landing zone, these won't allow you, even if you're close to it, to do the same thing. So
Sure.
those are some things that people probably need to understand about the machine room as well.
Sure.
Yeah, just to add on to that is like I talked to a couple of the vendors, and just even opening the door from our point of view, without even when we shut off the power, in some cases it's not going to be achieved.
Okay.
So that's something that we have to understand about the newer MRLs that are coming online.
Okay.
Is that we may encounter, the discussion hole and with the power off and everything, and we're going through the discussion hole and this door is not open.
Sure.
So there's definitely something wrong. But
So maybe there's some
actually,
safety features
it's the engineering of the mechanics to not allow you to open the door, so you have to wait for the elevator technician to show up on scene.
Sure. So I guess it can encourage the engine companies, if it doesn't look right and it's beyond your scope, go ahead and activate Rescue 2 and Truck 3.
And once again, make the focus the patient, because at the end of the day, how fast we got to do and whether damage needs to occur, which should never occur. It should be a very few times when that should ever occur.
Sure.
Should be dictated on whether that person's in any medical distress.
Okay.
Most elevator calls we go on, for sure, we know are just inconvenience calls.
Sure.
Somebody's being inconvenienced and they want to get it. Now, believe me, from a person who was in college stuck in the elevator twice, you had somewhere in your mind you wanted to go,
Right.
and you were like, hey, now I'm inconvenienced. But by no means or measure is that an emergency.
True.
So firefighters then have to realize, slow down at that point. Whatever it is, at that point we enter property conservation. There's no life safety. There's no instant stabilization part left, except for now to make sure we don't do a lot of damage.
Sure.
And if you've talked to anybody in one of the unions for elevator company, you'll realize they're not even coming out there unless it's about like $50 to $100 an hour
Sure.
to do a job. So then we're costing our customers. So the only person who's going to be harmed from us doing too much too fast is the person who we came out there, and we should be more professional to take care of them so that they are not paying $6,000 to $10,000 for a repair.
Sure.
When all it was the person, as soon as you open the door, they go, all right, now I'm going to McDonald's.
Sure.
Right.
So as far as the elevator technician responding, would you say be patient and let the expert?
And the biggest thing is make sure they're actually on the way. We've had many calls where everybody's so busy trying to use the tools, but we put that in many times to make sure if certain levels, to make sure again that the elevator technician has been called.
So can a company officer request an elevator technician through Richmond Communications?
Yes, definitely. I would say do that as soon as possible. Even in many cases, if there's a empty elevator, if there was a fault in the system, there's nothing wrong with having that technician come out and just to check it.
Sure.
That's their job. The same thing as calling us for a fire alarm. That's their job.
Right. I think the biggest thing is to realize we're dabbling in somebody else's world.
Right.
And so let the professionals handle that. And reminding everybody just to go ahead and leave if it was malfunctioning when you got there, we're
Yes.
going to leave the power off when we leave, because we didn't fix it. We just resolved an issue. So a lot of times people used to have an issue with, now we're leaving this situation. Well, it would have been that way if we hadn't got involved in it anyway.
Okay.
So if it was stalled when you got there, just because you circulated power, it seems to be working.
Yeah.
The second time someone gets stalled in that elevator, that one's on the fire department.
Okay. Right. So we don't want to say that we're the ones that fixed it.
We did. Right.
Sure. So again, thank you, gentlemen, for the conversation today. You brought up some really good, valid points. So I guess some of the takeaways are pre-planning your district, training on this topic, knowing policies and procedures. Do you have anything to add, Chief Epps, before we conclude? Sir?
No, I think that's probably the biggest points of the takeaways we should have in this one.
Okay. Captain Harris?
No, I think we covered good ground today.
Okay. Thank you, Richmond family, for listening. That wraps up our conversation about elevator incidents. Hope everyone has a great day.